If you turn your Bibles to John chapter 6, we're going to be studying today from John 6 the first few verses concerning the feeding of the 5,000. So let's just read verses 1 through 14 together. John chapter 6. Crowd's a little light today. Maybe people anticipating the bad weather coming later today. Let's begin reading in verse 1. After these things, Jesus went away to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, or Tiberias. And a great multitude was following him because they were seeing the signs which he was performing on those who were sick. And Jesus went up on the mountain, and there he sat with his disciples. Now the Passover feast of the Jews was at hand. Jesus, therefore, lifting up his eyes and seeing that a great multitude was coming to him, said to Philip, "Where are we to buy bread for these that they may eat?" And this he was saying to test him, for he himself knew what he was intending to do. Philip answered him, 200 denarii worth of bread is not sufficient for them, for everyone to receive a little. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, "There is a lad here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish, but what are these for so many people?" Jesus said, "Have the people sit down." Now there was much grass in the place. So the men sat down, and the number was about 5,000. And Jesus therefore took the loaves, and having given thanks, he distributed to those who were seated. Likewise also the fish, as much as they wanted. And when they were filled, he said to his disciples, "Gather up the leftover fragments, that nothing may be lost." And so they gathered them up, and filled 12 baskets with fragments from the 5 barley loaves, which were left over by those who had eaten. And when therefore the people saw the sign which he had performed, they said, "This is of truth the prophet who was to come into the world." Now I don't have in this reading verse 15, but you can see they are so impressed in verse 15 by what they had just witnessed that they had in their hearts or in their minds to make Jesus king by force. And Jesus perceives this and withdraws because, of course, his time had not yet come. And their understanding of Jesus and the nature of his kingdom was wrong. So anyway, I wanted to show you here the Sea of Galilee. John has Tiberias. If you'll look at this map of Palestine, you'll notice and know that the Sea of Galilee is up to the north. The region up where Jesus was raised, where he grew up, close to Nazareth, about 20 miles away. Let's go to the next slide. This is actually, it's very difficult to see in here, it's a little washed out, but this is a satellite picture of the Sea of Galilee. And you can see this town here of Tiberias. When Susan and I went to Israel many years ago now, we stayed in the city of Tiberias. But you can see to the north there, Capernaum, the Mount of Beatitudes, Magdala, Bethsaida, some of the towns that are mentioned in the Bible, all here around the Sea of Galilee. Let's go to the next slide. This is actually a picture, a modern-day picture of Tiberias. I wanted to show you this because I wanted you to see that it is mountainous or hilly around the sea. The sea is at a very low sea level, below sea level, but all around are these hills. And so when it says Jesus went up into the mountain to pray, he would have gone up to one of the tops of these hills somewhere, and he could look out and see the sea often below him. One more slide, I believe, picture. This is a picture that I actually took. It's a little hard to tell, but up to the far right of the picture is the Sea of Galilee. And even today, there are all these grassy fields that are around. And the Bible tells us that there was a great multitude of people. They're all following Jesus. When he goes from one side of the sea to the other, they follow him. They walk around the sea to the other side through all this grass. And so there was plenty of places for the people to sit down in the grass. Maybe it wasn't this tall at that time, you know, they may have been trampled down, but still There were places for the people to sit and to eat when he fed them. Mark's account in Mark chapter 6 says that it was green grass. He commanded them to all sit down by groups on the green grass, and they sat down in groups of hundreds and groups of 50s. Did you know that other than the resurrection, that this miracle is the only miracle that's given in all 4 of the Gospels? Now you wonder why. What is the significance of this particular miracle that all 4 of the Gospels mention? The only one besides the resurrection that are mentioned in all 4 of the gospel accounts. Matthew 14:21 says there were 5,000 men, but it also includes this phrase, not including women and children. So if it's just counting kind of the men who were there, so the feeding of the 5,000, the way we always refer to it, but probably that's inaccurate when you think about the number of people who are actually there. If there were 5,000 men and some of their wives were with them, maybe some not, but some of their children perhaps with them as well, and as these crowds of people are following around, we might consider there could be 10 to 15,000 people. That's a lot of people. If you think about it in terms maybe of our own city that we live in, a city of 13,000, imagine the whole city, everybody in all of town, all assembling together to be following Jesus around. That'd be quite a crowd of people. Jesus is going to feed all of them. It's an impressive thing. Let's go to the next slide. Now the disciples had seen Jesus do many miracles, including stilling the storm, raising the dead. They'd recently, in Matthew 10, verse 1, been empowered to perform miracles as they went out among the people. Why do you think they were still baffled by what to do? This wasn't the first time that Jesus had asked them or had tested them or had looked at their faith. Why do you think that they were baffled by what to do? I want to divide the lesson up into 4 different phrases that are used in this text. I've been doing it this way a little bit in my readings because I want us in our lessons to consider how John maybe even is unique. But John uses these 4 phrases: lifting up his eyes, to test him. From verse 9, what are these for so many? And verse 11, as much as they wanted. So we'll use this as our outline. First, let's consider lifted up his eyes. Verse 5, therefore Jesus, lifting up his eyes and seeing that a large crowd was coming to him, said to Philip, where are we to buy bread so that these may eat? Now I just picked this picture off of the internet because I want you to think, as Jesus is there and he lifts up his eyes and maybe sees a scene kind of like this. I'm kind of a visual person. So I think, well, what if Jesus looked and saw a group like this? It's kind of remote. There's grass, places to sit down. Maybe not as remote as this picture kind of shows, but remote in that it is far away from town. That there's not vendors all around trying to sell things. There's nothing to eat. So all these people have been listening to Jesus, following him around. John tells us that they are following him mainly because of all the signs that he's been doing and the healing that he has been. So you have a group of sick people and people who have maladies and infirmities, and they're following Jesus. Jesus is healing them, and the crowd's getting bigger and bigger. And Jesus looks up and he sees this multitude of people. He lifted up his eyes, John says, but Matthew says it this way. And when Jesus landed and saw a large crowd, he had compassion on them and healed their sick. In chapter 15 and verse 32 of Matthew, concerning the feeding of the 4,000, we find a similar phrase. Jesus called his disciples to him and said, I have compassion for these people, for they have already been with me 3 days and have nothing to eat. So the idea of Jesus lifting up his eyes is he's lifting up his eyes and he's seeing the needs of people and he has compassion for them because they're hungry. When Jesus lifted his eyes then and saw the people, his heart was flooded with compassion. And aren't you glad? I'm so thankful that as we read the pages of Scripture, the Gospels, that we find many occasions where Jesus is filled with compassion. He's touched by the hurts of other people. He's touched by their hunger, by their suffering. He's touched by their sins. He has compassion. It really shows us then and teaches us about compassion that true compassion consists really of two different things. It's seeing the needs, but it's also helping others in their needs. Because if you think about it, really compassion that is true compassion is a compassion that's more than just feeling sorry for people. Whenever a person truly has a compassion that's really compassion, it's a compassion that leads to helping or to doing something about it. And so it is having a heart that is moved to help. And Jesus, of course, has both of these. In 1 John 3, 17 and 18, John, the same writer that we're studying in the book of John, the Gospel of John, writes, if anyone has material possession and sees a brother or sister in need but has no pity on him, how can the love of God be in that person? Dear children, let us not love with words or speech, but with actions and in truth. So true love or true compassion is more than just verbalization of the need or that there's a sense of feeling sorry for the person. It's a person who loves with their actions, that truly loves. Psalm 145, the Lord is gracious and compassionate, slow to anger and rich in love. The Lord is good to all. He has compassion on all He has made. There's a very real thing called the bystander effect. The bystander effect is basically this. It's the expectation that someone else is going to take care of it. That's the bystander effect. Seeing that something needs to be done, but we all see ourselves as bystanders. Well, someone else is going to stop and help that person. Someone else will take care of that. Or I sure hope someone else does that. So maybe there's a whole group of people and everyone who's there all kind of feels compassion towards this event or what's going on or towards the person, but everyone considers themselves as a bystander. Who's going to take care of that? Who's going to do something? So we kind of have to overcome this bystander effect if we're going to be compassionate people and to say, I'm not going to be one who just waits for someone else to offer assistance or to show compassion through their actions. I'm going to be the one to do that. Now, when I was a younger person, there was a song that came out by, I think it was one of the a cappella groups, I believe, maybe even a cappella itself, that kind of they had words that were something like this. Go to the next slide. Everybody knows that anybody could do all the things that nobody did. You all remember that song? Kind of a little catchy little tune to it. No, go back. I want to talk about that a second. Yeah. Really, if you think about it, it's kind of a tongue-twisting kind of phrase, but it really makes sense. And it describes the way we offer ourselves at times, and that is, everybody knows this is something that needs to be done, and so everybody's standing around waiting for someone else to do the thing that nobody does. And if we aren't careful, that will be the way that we end up in our service to one another. It is waiting for someone else to do it when it's something we should be doing ourselves. So do we expect everyone else to be doing the things that we ourselves should be doing? Is our compassion compelling? And when I ask the question, is our compassion compelling, what I mean is, do we feel compelled to act upon that compassion? Jesus was compassionate towards the crowd. He is compassionate still. And we who desire to be like Him ought to be compassionate people. Wouldn't it be great if the Northside Church of Christ was known foremost in this community as the most compassionate people? Wouldn't that be something good? Secondly, let's consider the phrase then, to test Him. We find this, and we're going to see it more throughout the Gospels as we study the book of John, that Jesus oftentimes will do things in order to test his disciples. So he lifted up his eyes, he showed compassion, but the question that he asked in order to test him. John is the only gospel that reveals that the question was directed at Philip. Now, they were all there because in the other account says he asked his disciples this question. So others perhaps were there listening as well, because Andrew is going to pipe up and he's going to give an answer as well. But this account tells us in John verses 5 and 6, then Philip said, "Where are we to buy bread so that these may eat?" This he said to test him, for he himself knew what he was intending to do. So why would Jesus test his disciples in this way? Why would he test them? I would like for you to consider that just like in our last lesson on the nobleman, Jesus was testing the disciples' earnestness. He was nurturing, challenging, and cultivating the growth of his disciples' faith. So what do you think we need to do about this, guys? Philip, what should we do? All these people are hungry. What should we do? Then they have to think about it. They have to consider it. They have to consider what limitations do we have here. They try to come up with some kind of an answer. Jesus is challenging them. He's nurturing them, cultivating their faith. He wants them to think outside the box, to think about the possibilities that come with Christ, not the limitations that come without Christ or by our own human nature. Matthew 14, Matthew writes in his account, when it was evening, the disciples came to him and said, "This place is desolate, and the hour is already late, so send the crowds away that they may go into the villages and buy food for themselves." But Jesus said to them, "They do not need to go away. You give them something to eat." So Jesus just puts it upon them. They have to think about it. Philip, though, resorted to a mathematical solution. He goes immediately into considering how much it's going to cost, and they don't have anything like that. We don't know what to do. But it really was not intended at all to be a mathematical test. It was a faith test. But it's like our human nature, isn't it? To immediately go into thinking about the mathematical solution. It was a test, though, to test his faith. In verse 9, then, we have the third phrase I would like for us to consider, and that is, what are these for so many? William Barclay has written that the 5 loaves and 2 fish did not seem like much, but Jesus took it and worked wonders with it. In the hands of Jesus, little is always much. We may think that we have little of talent or substance to give to Jesus, but if we put ourselves into the hands of Jesus Christ, there is no telling what he can do with us and through us. I'd like for you to consider Mark chapter 6, if you'll take your Bibles and turn there for a moment. Mark chapter 6. So if you'll look in the book of Mark, you'll see that in verse 33, we have the beginning of the account of the feeding of the 5,000. And then immediately at the end, beginning in verse 45, and immediately he made his disciples get into the boat and go ahead of him to the other side of Bethsaida, while he himself was sending the multitude away. And after bidding them farewell, he departed to the mountain to pray. And when it was evening, the boat was in the midst of the sea, and he was alone on the land. And seeing them straining at the oars, for the wind was against them, at about the 4th watch of the night, he came to them walking on the sea, and he intended to pass by them. But when they saw him walking on the sea, they supposed that it was a ghost, and they cried out. For they all saw him and were frightened. But immediately he spoke to them and said, "Take courage, it is I, do not be afraid." And he got into the boat with them, and the wind stopped, and they were greatly astonished. Now look at verse 52. It almost seems misplaced here, but look at verse 52. For they had not gained any insight from the incident of the loaves, but their heart was hardened. Now, what do you suppose is meant by that verse? Jesus is trying to establish among his disciples a deep dependency upon him, to show his limitlessness, to show that he is the sustainer, that he can do all things, that they are to rely upon him and to trust him. And so he's just fed the 5,000, but they didn't learn anything by that. They didn't learn that in this great miracle where Jesus has fed perhaps up to 10 or 15,000 people with just a little basket of food, with 12 basketfuls left over. The limitlessness of things that can be done through Christ. They didn't learn that. And so then when Jesus comes to them and he's walking on the water, they're astonished and bewildered by that as well. And then Mark writes, for they had not gained any insight into the incident of the loaves. You see, they still couldn't quite grasp the limitlessness of Jesus, of his greatness, of his power, and that they are to completely trust him. The New International Version says, for they had not understood about the loaves, their hearts were hardened. The King James Version says, for they considered not the miracle of the loaves, for their heart was hardened. And the New Living Translation says, for they still didn't understand the significance of the miracle of the loaves, their hearts were too hard to take it in. They were still asking, what are these among so many? This is all we have. Let's figure out a solution here. You know, if we aren't careful, we can do that in the church. We limit ourselves according to our own limitations, and we forget about Christ's limitlessness. And so we make all of our plans and all the dreams and things that we do according to what we can do. And we forget about how much God can do. Verse 11, as much as they wanted. As much as they wanted. Verses 11 and 12 say, he distributed to those who were seated likewise also the fish as much as they wanted. And they were filled, and he said to his disciples, gather up the leftover fragments so that nothing will be lost. Now, some have used this to speak about how Jesus didn't want there to be any waste, and he says, let nothing be wasted. Gather up the fragments so nothing will be lost. But I want you to consider the completeness of this miracle. It wasn't that 5,000 or 10,000 people got a little bit to eat. They had all they wanted to eat. Now, if you've ever been to a buffet, you know some people can go back and keep going back and keep going back. All these people were all full. They'd eaten all they wanted. They had all the bread they wanted, all the fish they wanted. This great multitude of people, all of them full. Oh, full. And so full that there's still food left. And anybody else want any more? Okay, well, let's gather up what's left. And there's 12 baskets that are gathered up that people didn't even want. They're so full that they couldn't eat anymore. Wow. The completeness then, the magnitude of the miracle, that people had eaten as much bread and much fish, as much as they wanted, and when they were filled, he said, gather up what is left. There was no doubt of the completeness, the magnitude, the wonder of this miracle. So Jesus not only gave food to thousands of people, he gave them food until they were all completely full with food to spare. And the overriding message is the sufficiency of Christ. He's sufficient, completely sufficient. In the miracle of the 5,000, Jesus was training the disciples for a complete reliance upon the sufficiency of Christ's power, seeing the world through the lens of Christ's limitlessness rather than our own limitations. Now, how important was this going to be for them when Jesus was lifted up into heaven and they were there to accomplish His work upon the earth? How much were they going to have to rely upon the sufficiency of Christ, upon His power? How important was it that they learned this message, that they were trained to know that they're going to have to rely upon Christ when things are tough, when they're abused, when they're rejected, when their message is being given to people who don't want to hear it. To see the world through the lens of Christ's limitlessness rather than through their own limitations. They were going to have to rely upon Him. On another occasion in Matthew 19, and looking upon them, Jesus said to them, with men this is impossible, but with God all things are possible. There again, another example of where Jesus is training. You know, you're looking at this strictly from a human perspective, and it may not be possible from that perspective, but with His perspective, all things are possible. In what ways do you suspect that we are limited to small thinking? What factors keep us from bold, visionary thinking? What can God not do? I would like to suggest to you that we are only limited by our own smallness. God is not small. How would our church be different if we saw our commission, our Great Commission, through the lens of Christ's limitlessness? Do you think that our vision is sometimes small because of our own small thinking? Or what about our compassion that might drive our vision? Is our compassion compelling? Is it more than just seeing the task at hand? Is it being driven because of the depths of our compassion to help? When we see the lostness of the world, do we just feel in our hearts that sadness that so many are lost? Or does it drive us? Does it compel us to want to do something about it? And when we see the overwhelmingness of the task, do we throw our hands up and say there's nothing we can do as calculated by our own small thinking? Or do we realize there is a lot that we can do when driven by the greatness of God? Jesus was compassionate, and we who desire to be like Him ought to be compassionate as well. Compassionate towards the infirmities of people, towards their hurts and pains, but also towards their lostness. When faced with godly works that need to be done, are we limited to only mathematical solutions? Or are our works of service based upon faith? Are they based upon math or faith? May we see the world through the lens of Christ's limitlessness rather than our own limitations. I believe these are the messages of the feeding of the 5,000. It really has more to do than people having their stomachs filled. And it has more to do with the limitlessness and the sufficiency of Christ. If you'd like to respond this morning, we'd love to take your confession or to pray for you. If you have something that you're struggling with in your life, we'd love to pray with you. Or if you'd like to become a Christian, we'd love to witness your baptism today. If you'd like any of these things, will you come as we stand and sing?